Hi, my name is Avi Stamen, and I am the CEO and Managing Director of Academic Language Experts. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar on the 5 secrets to publishing your academic paper. Now, the reason that I put this webinar together is because we receive a lot of submissions and a lot of projects from clients from all around the world who are looking to publish their research in top-tier academic journals. And we notice and we see a lot of submissions that have what I call fatal flaws or issues that need to be addressed before they're submitted for publication. And what I did was I basically gathered all of those tips that we've gleaned over the years from the thousands of submissions that we've helped with to try and give you an insider look into what it takes to publish an academic paper and how you can best approach the challenge and the task of publishing your research in the most effective way possible. So let's jump right in. So just a quick word about myself. As I said, I am the CEO and Managing Director of Academic Language Experts. We help academic scholars to translate, edit, and format their research for publication. We also help with preparing grant proposals and writing and editing grant proposals. So if you are a non-native English speaker or you need to publish in a language that's not your native tongue, feel free to be in touch. Give us a call, give us an email, send us an email. We'll be happy to discuss your particular challenge with you. All right, so when we start talking about publishing our research, we have to ask a very basic question, a question that's so simple, in fact, that we may not even think it needs to be asked. And that is, why is it that we want to publish our research? Why is it in general that academics publish their research? And the truth is that different individuals have different motivations for publishing, and it's really critical to hammer down what is our goal, what's our motivation in order to best approach the topic. So first of all, we need to understand that there are what I like to call pure motives and pragmatic motives. And there's nothing wrong with the pragmatic motives, but it's important to understand. So first of all, in terms of the pure motives, obviously, whenever we're going about writing a research paper, it's because we have something that we want to bring to the world. It may be theoretical, it may be practical, it may have impact on our local society, or it may not come to fruition for hundreds of years. But it's really important that we get it out there. And in order to get it out there in today's day and age, that means publishing in a reputable journal. And in general, that means publishing in a reputable journal in English. And we need to understand that that is the task in front of us if we really want our research to make an impact. Now, on a pragmatic level, we also need to understand that today our academic careers are judged by the caliber and frequency of our research. So as we all know, the famous adage, publish or perish. So we need to be publishing as often as possible without sacrificing on quality, obviously, in top tier journals in order to advance in our careers and in order, in a broader sense, to get our research out there, develop new partnerships, new opportunities for continued research, and to advance as career academics. Okay. Now, I want to ask a very basic question, and that is, why is it that publishing our research is so difficult? And the truth is that there are a lot of unique challenges to publishing our research, and we will try and tackle a number of them in this webinar. So first, I want to bring your attention to the comic on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, which reads, "Most scientists regarded the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement." So what you can see here is that if you feel sometimes as if the publication process is very intimidating and very challenging, don't worry, you're not alone. You're in good company. There are a lot of people who feel this way. So what are the minimum requirements to publish our paper? So number one is we obviously have to have a novel thesis or a novel idea. If our research has been published even in a different form somewhere else by other scholars who maybe beat us in terms of how quickly they were able to publish their research, or our research is more of a collection of a summary of other research, so it may not be worthy of being published in an academic journal. The second thing is competition. There is, we're generally not well aware of who it is that we're competing against these different journals, and how many people we're competing against. And there's a fascinating stat that I saw that on average, and this takes into account all the different subject areas, on average 80% of articles are rejected. And therefore we need to keep in mind that there's some serious heavy competition here. In certain journals, we're talking about a handful of articles that are published every year out of hundreds and hundreds of potential potential submissions. The peer review process can be incredibly challenging. Sometimes we get feedback from different reviewers, and the feedback can either, we sometimes feel like they didn't understand our research. Sometimes there are two different reviewers that will give contradictory feedback, and we're left not knowing how to address it. Sometimes we agree and appreciate the feedback, but we don't know exactly how to implement it. We realize, we basically understand that if we really want to take their feedback into account, we need to rethink our entire research basis, and that can be, very disappointing and challenging. Language challenges. This is especially true for scholars for whom English is not their native tongue. So for them, the challenge in the process of taking their paper, either writing it in English, which is not their native language, or writing it in a foreign language and then translating it, can be a very intimidating and costly endeavor. And there's a certain amount of what in the field is called linguistic bias, which means that journal editors tend to prefer submissions that are completed by native English speakers over those that are completed by non-native English speakers. And that can be a real challenge for scholars for whom English is not their native language. The process itself can be very arduous, in the sense that on average takes about 6 months from the time that we actually submit our article till we get some sort of an answer, whether it's accepted or revise and resubmit or rejected, till we get a final, some sort of concrete answer. And then another 6 months from the time we get that answer, assuming it's positive, till it's actually published. And what that means is that we need to go in with the mindset of, this is going to take me a year. Oftentimes I get requests from people who are up for promotion, and they say, I've got a hearing next month, or in 3 months, 5 months. Can you help me publish a bunch of articles right before my hearing? And I tell them, unfortunately, it's probably too late. Even if we work at the speed of light, the application, the submission, and acceptance process can be longer. And finally, references, which sometimes we take for granted in terms of how much work and time and effort goes into putting the references in properly, adapting them to the different journal style guides. And we're going to discuss all of these issues and how we can make it easiest on ourselves and give ourselves the best chance of succeeding in the competitive academic landscape. All right, I'm going to put myself back up in the corner here now that it doesn't block any text. And I want to start getting an insight into some of these issues with the help of Professor Peter Thrower. And what Professor Thrower did is he basically took the, he himself is a journal editor and reviews hundreds of manuscripts a year. And he said, I want to peel back the curtain on why it is that myself and my colleagues reject certain articles and accept other articles. And I think this really gives us a good insight into the publication process. So the first thing that he mentions seems to be maybe a technical point, but it's actually quite interesting, is that the article fails the technical screening. And what he means by the technical screening is that in nearly every journal, there are intricate author guidelines in terms of how to submit what the article, if there's a specific style guide or formatting system to be used for the article, and how it should be submitted on the online portal. And what happens oftentimes is that authors don't carefully enough read the instructions. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they do halfway. And they're left with an article which isn't necessarily ready in terms of the requirements of the journal, and they just submit it sort of half-baked. And it's the truth is that in terms of the intricate formatting requirements, I have seen situations whereby journals will accept or at least agree to review an article that has, that isn't exactly formatted correctly, assuming that the content is worthy. That being said, I've seen more journals who have said, we're not even looking at the article until it's formatted according to the specific style guide that we have requested and all of our guidelines and instructions. And the truth is that from the author's perspective, I think it really does make sense to put in the time and effort and energy to format the paper correctly ahead of time or according to the journal guidelines, simply because it shows that we didn't just take our generic article and send it off hoping for the best, but really there was some insight, some thought put in terms of where we wanted to send it. And it wasn't that we just sent it off wherever. And if we haven't formatted the article accordingly, it sort of shows that we didn't necessarily intend for this article to get to this journal. It ended up here, but maybe that wasn't intentional. That's not the impression that we want to give off. The second issue becomes that it doesn't fall within the aims and scopes of the journal. And that's the question of finding the right match between our article and the journal. Too often I hear from scholars who submit to certain journals because they've heard that their colleagues publish in that journal, or because they like the impact factor, or because it's well known in their field, but they don't scrutinize and think carefully enough about what the connection is between the specific journal that they want to submit to and their article. A very simple question that I think we should always be asking ourselves is, okay, how similar is my article to previous articles that have been submitted in the same exact journal? And if the answer is, well, it's not so similar, then we have to really dig down and think to ourselves, okay, well, is my article so groundbreaking that they're going to decide to publish it even though they haven't published similar things in the past? Or maybe more likely, it's going to get rejected as a result, and maybe I should consider somewhere else where there are articles that are more similar to my own. And that's a good indication. If we look back one or two issues ago and read through those articles, or at least the abstracts, we get a good impression of where we should and should not be submitting to. The procedures or analysis are seen as defective. Obviously, this touches on the heart of the research itself, and this is something that whereby we really need to make sure that we're solid in terms of our research basis in order to submit. Now, that being said, there are times where a reviewer will come along and say, well, I didn't agree with the methodology used. I think you should have used X. I think you should have used Y. And we have good reason for not using Y. Or we considered it, but decided to go with a different approach for pragmatic reasons. So those are things that those are considerations that we need to take into account. Sometimes that means that if we get the impression that the reviewer is telling us, I'm not interested because you didn't use the methodology I would have used, then we probably should move on. If we think that we have good justification and good rationale and they're just asking why, then it might be worth answering and explaining and justifying ourselves, and they may accept our reply. The conclusions aren't justified. I had an interesting case a few months ago of a client with really fascinating research. And the premise of her research was as follows. She wanted to study the difference between scholars between students who are studying inside the classroom and students who are studying outside on a nice, lovely day. And she wanted to understand the differences in terms of learning and retention. And what was really fascinating and I guess disappointing for her is that the article was rejected because the conclusions went too far. The reviewers liked the article, they agreed with her concept, with the way she went about the research, but she had only studied 2 schools in a specific geographic area. And in her conclusions, she tried to take the lessons that she had gleaned from her specific study and apply them in all sorts of situations whereby there were other factors that impacted the environment, the socioeconomic level, the type of school, et cetera, that made it not so clear that she really could make those jumps in logic. And what ended up happening was, and what the reviewer wrote to her, and I think this is a great insight, is that every research, every study has a certain level of belief or a certain level of trusting that the author is really reflecting in the paper what happened in the study. And if all of a sudden that basis gets shaken up a little bit because the author seems to have exaggerated in their conclusions or how they understand the research, then it can really actually boomerang and backfire. And what I always recommend is to put in a line about potential future research that could be recommended, certain weaknesses or points that weren't covered in the research. And in that way, what we're saying is we understand that this isn't solving every problem that we wanted to solve or isn't answering every question that we had. But maybe it's the beginning of a direction. Maybe this will lead to future research, future articles, partnerships, and it's worth exploring. But we need to be honest. And the last one, it's incomprehensible. If a journal editor, okay, or a reviewer needs to try and understand what it is that you're saying and not focus on the content of your message, then the chances that they're going to take the time to really delve in and parse your sentences and understand exactly what it is that you're saying is pretty low. Most of the time, they're just going to reject it and prefer a paper which is clearly written. And this can be true both for language, but can also be true for structure and writing style. And the best way to make sure that we, aside from taking writing classes and always improving our writing, is to really share our research with our colleagues, get their feedback, and see if it's clear to them. And if it's going to be clear to them, then hopefully it's going to be clear to others as well. Okay. So now that we've had, the beginning of this webinar has been somewhat depressing in the sense that we've raised all these challenges and difficulties in publishing our research. Now we need to start giving some answers and to address the question of how do we reach the summit? How do we actually conquer our fears, conquer the challenges in our way, and be able to successfully publish our research? All right, so the first and foremost is choosing the correct journal for publication. And there are a lot of factors that go into how do we make sure to find the right journal. I want to highlight what I believe to be the most important factors, not to say that there aren't other factors. So first of all is finding the right match for your article. And I said this before, but I'll repeat it. We need to make sure that that our research is really hitting on a topic which the journal cares about, which is important to them, which is in their aims and scopes. And that's the first way to do it, is looking at their aims and scopes, but also looking at previous versions, previous issues of the journal to see, is this an issue they care about? Is this something that's going to be worth my time to submit there? Okay, once we do that, obviously we're going to narrow it down to a number of different options, and then we can start thinking about impact factor. And impact factor is, for better or for worse, one of the ways that we measure the importance of a particular journal. And for those who aren't familiar, basically impact factor is a measuring tool which basically says how many times is this journal quoted in other journals, okay? And what has happened, the evolution of the impact factor, is it's basically been a way for academics to say, okay, this is a journal that I want to publish in because it's quoted often in other journals, and theoretically means means it's a more impactful journal and has more impact on the field. Whereas a journal with a lower impact factor is not quoted as often. And more recently, they've sort of grouped them by quarters. So there's Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, with Q1 being the top group of journals, Q2, etc. Now, I don't want to get into a full-blown discussion about the merits and problems with impact factor as a gauge for successful research. What I do want to say is that on the one hand, it's important for us to take it into account because in most academic institutions, that's one of the criteria that we're judged by. I do want to say that there are major issues with impact factor. So for example, it's encouraged sharing of citation sharing. So what that means is that I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Oftentimes, there are scholars who say, okay, you can quote me in this article, I quote you in that article, and we're starting to distance ourselves from pure academic insight. In addition, one of the other issues with the impact factor is that just because something is quoted doesn't necessarily mean it's a measure of its quality. There are examples of articles that were published that were flatly rejected and are mentioned in many other articles as a starting point of problematic research, and those the journals end up having good impact factors despite the fact that the research was not either not accurate or had serious problems. Now, what I like encouraging people to do is, in addition to the impact factor, or in addition to the Q ranking, starting to look at some of the other factors that have a real impact on our chances of acceptance. And again, we need to remind ourselves, 80% of articles are rejected. So let's give ourselves the best chance possible to get accepted. So number 3 is acceptance percentage. And this is something that most scholars that I speak to do not check. And what that means is that journals are more often, or the trend is more common, the journals will declare about themselves that they accept a certain percentage of articles to their journal. Now, we need to take this seriously, because there can be a big difference between a journal that accepts 5% of the applicants to a journal that accepts 15%. And that could be a big difference in terms of our chances of being accepted. Now, obviously, we believe in the value of our own research on its own merits. But if we're thinking about it within the context of other researchers that are also interested in publishing in this journal, so we need to keep that in mind. This as well, I want to say that we need to proceed with caution in terms of how important we make the acceptance percentage, simply because of the following story. I was at the library one day, a library where a lot of academics make their home, or their second home, as it may be. And I was sitting next to a scholar who I know personally, and I happen to know that he is a journal editor. And I heard him get a call, and I heard one half of the conversation, and he was saying that his journal accepts 5% of the submissions that it receives on an annual basis. And I was shocked, because I know his journal, and I know that there's no way he gets enough submissions to only accept 5%. He wouldn't have a journal. So after the phone call, I said, "Who are you speaking with?" And he said, "I was speaking with the Australian institution that's in charge of basically gathering all of the data in order to judge quality of journals and rank them." And so I said, "Why did you say you accept 5% of entries?" He said, "No, I don't accept 5%. I accept 50%. So I said, "Why did you say that?" He said, "Because right now I'm going to have a rank of A in the global ranking in terms of the value of my journal. And had I said 50%, I would have had a very poor ranking." So because it's self-reported data, we need to keep that in mind as well. That being said, I still think it's a factor that we should consider, even if there are problematic instances, only because it gives us an insight into where we can most likely publish. And I especially want to stress this and emphasize this for younger scholars, for whom sometimes their dream is to get into the top journal right away, but sometimes that can actually lead to a situation in a scenario whereby many years they're trying to get their first article. Maybe it's an article based on their doctorate, or maybe they wrote a doctorate of articles, and they're still stuck because they're shooting for the way top. And most scholars, even most senior scholars, would say that if they look back, they realize they've learned a lot about the academic publication process, about their own research, since that time, and maybe it makes more sense to go to a Q2 journal, publish there, get it out of the way, get running, have some positive momentum, get some feedback from other scholars in our field, get some name recognition, and already be working on our next research as opposed to being stuck with the original study that we had. Because keep in mind, and this is an important point, oftentimes, especially when it takes a long time for the journal to get back to us with feedback, oftentimes we're dealing with revisions on articles for studies that we finished years ago. And sometimes we can't even see them anymore. We're so sick and tired of them. And other times the research has gotten old, and we need to update it. And the more that there's delays, and the more that we're aiming for, really impossible, I shouldn't say impossible, but aiming for, very difficult journals with low acceptance percentages, it makes it a challenge. The speed of the response time, okay? And this is also something which, especially the journals that are good about responding quickly, this is more common in open access journals, which we will discuss shortly, are very proud of the fact that it takes them a lesser amount of time than average to respond. Now, we need to understand that there's a good reason why it takes a long time. And the reason for that is that reviewers are in 99% of cases are not paid. They do their work voluntarily, and it's not at the top of the priority list in terms of reviewing articles and giving feedback. So a journal that does respond quickly can be a big advantage in the sense that we know where we're at with them and it's not stuck for a long time. And finally, the length of the article. This is something that I see very, very often, are scholars who send an article and it's just too long for publication. This is especially true, by the way, for non-native English speakers who are writing in a different language, whatever language that may be, and translating to English. Oftentimes, most of the time, the English is considerably longer than the source language. And what happens is that maybe you had an article in Arabic of 9,000 words, but then when it came back, it was 11,000 words, and the journal limit is 10,000, and now you're stuck with an article that's too long. So have that in mind already when you start thinking about which places are up for consideration. You need to sort of write the article with that in mind, because you may end up with an article that's 2 times too long to be published. Now, before we move on, I want to bring your attention to the bottom of the screen, whereby you'll find almost on every screen a link to additional information about the specific topic that we're talking about. I highly recommend in your free time taking a look at some of these blogs that we put up on our website, especially if it's a topic that you want to learn more about. I also want to bring your attention to the right-hand side of the screen with the blue background, because these are some really helpful links in terms of finding impact factor and trying to understand which journals have a high impact factor, finding journals, a search for journals in general. A word of caution: it's searching here is like searching on Google. You'll get some answers that are excellent. You'll get some answers that are totally irrelevant. So you need to be critical when you're looking through these lists and acceptance percentages. This is like I said, is starting to become more prevalent. You can see if your journal says about itself how many applicants they have and what percentage of submissions they accept. Now, in the previous screen, the previous slide, I would stamp with my official stamp of approval and say that I would wholly recommend those strategies. On this screen, I do not. I'm putting my stamp of approval away, and I am sharing some ideas with you that scholars have shared with me over the years that I think you should know about. I'm not saying that you should use them, but they're interesting, and they all have upsides and downsides. And you have to determine for yourself whether in each case, in each particular journal, the upside, it's worth taking that risk. Okay, so the first idea is reaching out to the journal. So what I mean by that is either if you want to reach out to the journal editor, or you want to reach out to the desk editor and pitch them your idea, tell them about what your article is about, and see if they express an interest. See if that's something that they would want to accept as a submission, or if they don't respond, or if they say no thank you. The best answer we could get, the truth is no, because then we know, okay, we didn't waste 6 weeks now trying to submit and format, and it's not worthwhile. That being said, in many to most journals, they'll say submit on our online form, and then we'll get back to you. We're not, don't contact us personally. What I would say is, if there's some sort of connection that we have, and this connects to number 3 of look for the local. If there's someone that is connected to our university or affiliation, or there's someone that we know is going to be at a conference that we're coming to, maybe, and we can bring it up in a more natural human way as part of conversation, or get one of our mutual colleagues to introduce us, then that's an idea of something, of a tip that can really help us save time and get us an in. In the end, we're all people, and we all, appreciate a human touch. The second idea was rejection as a strategy, also to be taken with caution. But I do know one scholar who tells me that she always submits every article that she writes to the same journal with no expectation, which is an excellent journal, with almost no expectation that it's going to get accepted, that journal. But they give excellent feedback in a short amount of time. And she finds that it's so helpful to her research that she gets such great feedback that it's worth submitting knowing she's not going to get accepted, just to get the insight and feedback from the reviewers. Now, this can also backfire if we're taking a risk with our reputation. If the reviewers find out who it is that we are and say, well, what is this half-baked research? We might not want to do that. On the other hand, if there's a really top journal and we know that they'll get back to us really quickly, maybe it's worth sending off if we're at least confident enough with our research. All right. The fourth tip goes to something, I guess, contradicts what I said in the previous screen, which is the issue with sharing citations. I will say that, quoting and bringing citations from the journal editors or from some of the board members can be helpful. I wouldn't exaggerate. I wouldn't bring them if they have nothing to do with your research. But if there's some sort of connection to something that they have written, and you can enter into some sort of dialogue with the journal editors, they'll appreciate that and they'll understand that. They may not agree with the way that you're with your approach, but they will appreciate the citation. So especially if it's called for, make sure that you don't forget about them. Some of them take it personally. Something that which is really interesting, which I started thinking about recently, was the result of a conversation that I had with a scholar that we work with, who has fascinating research. She's an interdisciplinary scholar, but a very high percentage of her papers are accepted. And I'd like to think that she has excellent research and that we help her along the way. But I was still curious how she managed to have such success. So I gave her a call and I asked her, and she said, very simple, I answer call for papers. And I said, what? What is it? Like, why does that help? So she said, I wait until there's a call for papers. Most people don't answer call for papers because it's not exactly in, they don't exactly have something written in that specific topic. And there's generally short deadlines by the time people find out about them and have the time to write up a paper and do the research. Most people don't do it. And sometimes they're call for papers from excellent journals. And in that way, she sort of circumvents the traditional publication method route and has a lot of success. Now, it takes a certain type of researcher and a certain type of research in order to do this, but I would recommend in all instances to keep your eyes out for call for papers in your field. If there are special issues that are coming out, you're going to want to take a look and see if maybe you have something that you can submit there. And finally, if there's a popular or hot topic, something that will bring some sort of notoriety or buzz around the journal that gets people excited about this issue, that can definitely help. Sometimes it's just a matter of phrasing your title and your subject line in an exciting way. But if there's something that relates to some sort of popular issue, either in culture or in your field of research, no reason not to make that connection. I apologize. It seems as if the screen is a bit jumpy today. Okay. The next issue that I want to discuss is the question of open access, okay? And I get a lot of questions on whether it makes sense to publish in open access, how exactly it works, and what are the considerations that we should take into account. Open access is a topic within itself, so we're not going to cover everything right now. But I do recommend that you take a look at this tweet from Ned Potter, which I think is hysterical and also a bit depressing. And basically, the point that he's trying to make is that, you know what, I'll give you a minute to go ahead and read. Okay, so the point that he's trying to make is that the academic publishing world is a bit broken in the sense that academic publishers, we have a very weird situation whereby governments are funding universities that are funding research, or private institutions that are funding research. They're funding the scholars who are conducting the research. And in the end, in order to have access to that research, we need to pay a third-party company, in this case the academic publishers, in order to even be able to read it. So I'm sure that you have run into a scenario whereby you've wanted to read a paper on a certain topic, and there's been a big paywall, and you don't have access to that. Now, hopefully you have access via some sort of university or institutional affiliation, but that's not always a possibility. And in those cases, it's really a shame that there's research that's basically hidden and blocked from view. And what the open access movement has come to fix this issue, has come to address it and basically say no. In the open access method, any research that's published is then available to anyone who wants to read it at any point in any time. And that's, you know, it's actually had very distinct and marked left a mark on the world of publication, in the sense that a recent study just showed that that articles that are published with open access or in open access have 4 times as many citations as articles that are not, and for the very simple reason that they're more accessible and can be read much easier. So that's something that's definitely worth considering when we are thinking about where to publish, whether we want to publish open access or not. Now, there are different types of open access. So there's the green plan versus the gold plan. It's worth doing a little bit of homework to see what you prefer or to see what makes sense. In certain cases, there are journals that will publish either in open access or the traditional method, depending on whether you pay the open access fees. The big challenge with open access is that basically what happens is that now the responsibility for funding, instead of being on the reader, is now on the author themselves. So it's another expense that we have to incur. That being said, there is slow change happening, and sometimes funders will cover the cost of open access, and sometimes we can put that in as a line in our budgetary requests. For example, when applying for funds to publish in open access. So that's something that we should consider. There are certain journals whereby the journal will be closed for the first 6 months and then become open access. There's different plans worth looking into. Now, Plan S is an interesting initiative from the European Union. It's not yet been finalized, but basically what they're trying to do as part of Plan S is say that your EU funded research must be published open access. And if that actually comes into fruition, then that will really be a game changer, in the sense that it's going to force a dramatic change in the publication landscape. And then I think open access will really become, if not mainstream, at least just as prevalent as the traditional method. That being said, in the meantime, because of the costs of open access to the author, it hasn't been fully adopted. Now, the costs can range. There are some journals that charge a couple $100s, and there are some that charge many thousands of dollars. So obviously that's something we would want to check. We also want to check whether the journal is going to charge us at the outset, or whether they're going to wait till our article is accepted until they charge us. So that's important. Now, one thing that we really need to be careful of is the issue of predatory journals. What's happened is basically piggybacking off the open access method are these journals which are predatory in the sense that they're not real and that they don't really do peer review. They don't have any sort of editing or review quality assurance process. And they basically just take your article, accept it, and throw it up on their website and then charge you whatever it is, a couple $1,000s. And we need to be wary of cases and scenarios whereby we're invited by some person we've never heard of to submit to a journal. Sometimes that's legitimate. We just need to check. If the journal website seems to be very not professionally done, there are serious English errors, the graphics are very old, from third world countries, we need to start thinking whether this is a real journal or not. Now, in this sense, we really need to thank Professor Beal, who put together a list of predatory journals. Since then, he's not involved with this list anymore, but you can still go on and see if you're suspect of a specific journal that's invited you to submit or that you found online, you're considering, you want to make sure it's legit. Go on to Beal's list, make sure that it doesn't appear on that list, and do your other due diligence, and then hopefully you'll be okay submitting to the journal. Obviously, you want to look at the names of the authors that have published there also. If it's the leading authors in your field, leading scholars in your field, then you have less to worry about. Okay. Now I want to move on to the topic of writing your paper, okay? And obviously, writing an academic paper is not just a separate webinar, but a course in and of itself. I just want to go over some of the main points that I find are most prevalent. So first of all, scholars, in an ideal world, I believe that scholars should be writing with their target audience in mind. And what I mean by that is writing with the journal that they're going to submit to in mind. And that means having read a few issues of the previous journal, of the same journal, the previous volumes, and trying to write with that audience in mind. That will help. First of all, it helps in not needing to do too many adaptations afterwards. And second of all, it helps that we are more focused and directed when we're doing our writing because we know who we're writing for. Also in terms of a word count, sometimes that helps us focus on how many words we should be writing. Writing with doing research together with other authors, having a co-author, that can be really helpful. In fact, statistically, studies that are written with 2 or more authors are more successful than studies that are written with one author alone. Now, I know in certain fields, it's discouraged to write everything together with a partner just because you want to be able to show that your research, that you have your own independent research. So you may want to balance that out. Obviously, there's also a difference here between the humanities and exact sciences, and you need to think about what's right in your case, but I would consider it. Discuss a topic that engages with previous research. So if in the last issue of this journal, they discussed a certain topic and you want to come either to add on that topic, disagree with the opinion that was stated, bring some contradictory research, that creates a dialogue, it creates a conversation, which is oftentimes missing in journals from volume to volume. And I think the journal editors appreciate it and they want it. They want to start a conversation. So that can really be helpful. And obviously it means that it's relevant to that specific journal if you're addressing research that's been discussed in that journal. You want to think ahead of time about how you're going to prepare your references. Okay, now reference preparation is one of the services that we provide. That being said, I highly encourage people to check out the different reference softwares that are out there. We have a blog on called Stop Wasting Time on Formatting that you can find below, which gives you some ideas. There's Mendeley, Zotero, EndNote. There's all sorts of different, even within Word, you can do some cool stuff. And the big advantage of the reference software programs is that basically it enables you to, with one click of the button, to go from one style to another. So let's say you've submitted your article to a journal and it's been rejected, and then you want to go, and that journal asked for MLA, and now you want to go to APA, it's one click instead of 10 hours of work. So that's something that's worth considering. Do your own peer review. What I mean by that is not you yourself, but send your article out to your peers for feedback, for insight, for corrections, for changes, for ideas. Make sure that they really buy in that they take the time to go over your research. Now, how do you do that in a way where you're not putting yourself at risk? Oftentimes scholars ask me, but I'm worried that it's going to get stolen. There's no perfect way. There have been cases whereby research has been shared without permission or even used and plagiarized. That being said, I think that the ideal scenario is if it's a two-way street. If you're helping your friend and your colleague to publish their research, to review their research, and they're helping you, so we're both basically giving our babies over to the other one. We're entrusting them, and that's something which helps make us feel at ease that our research is in good hands. Now, the other thing is that obviously, we don't want to always be asking favors. We want to be able to give back and not just be taking. And finally, write a great abstract. This image here on the right-hand side of the screen is something which I found in a research paper, which blew my mind. And that is the simple question was, what is it that journal editors, desk editors, read when they read your paper? And we would have thought that they read your paper, but the truth is that they don't read your paper. The majority of them are reading the title. A smaller group are reading the abstract, and only a very small percentage are reading the entire paper. And if we think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Let's say there's one desk editor for a journal that gets 150 submissions a year. To think that desk editor is reading, every other day is reading a full article and analyzing it and thinking about it, probably not happening. And therefore, we need to write a really killer title and abstract to make sure that our article is given a fair shot. Next, I want to discuss professional translation and editing services. And this is specifically for scholars who are trying to publish in a language that's not their native language. So I don't want to get into a discussion of whether you should be writing in your native language and translating versus editing. It's an important discussion. It's something that I'm happy to discuss in another forum. Obviously, it's also a very personal question that every scholar needs to decide for themselves. What I will say is, for those who do decide to write in their native tongue and translation is not enough. What I mean by that is even excellent award-winning translators need editors for the simple reason that they are creating a new text from scratch. Now, true, this text is not from their imagination alone. It's obviously based on the source text that was written in the source language. However, it is a new entity and a new creation. And for that reason, it needs to be edited just like any other text needs to be edited. Therefore, you need to keep this in mind. If you're going to hire a translator, ask them if they have someone who's reviewing and proofreading their work, or be ready to send someone else. I can tell you that in our business, at Academic Language Experts, every translation project has a translation and then editing by a second managing editor following the translation to make sure that it's really ready for publication. One way, so how do you find out who's a good translator? Or editor for that matter. So first of all, you can ask for samples. It's accepted within the industry to ask for a sample of work they've done previously, or you can give them part of a short piece of your text and ask them for a sample on that. You can, see if they've published papers in your field before. If they've never published in your field, or if they've never helped anyone publish or publish themselves, then be skeptical. Working with English speaking or whatever the target language, colleagues or neighbors is generally not enough. It really needs to be someone who's an expert in your field and has relevant academic experience in order to properly review and edit or translate your paper. There are a number of things that you can do as a scholar to actually help the process along. So the first one is you can make sure, you should make sure to give your language expert, your translator, editor, enough time in order to do their work properly. If it took you 2-3 months to do your research and then another 2 or 3 months to translate or edit your research, don't give 2 days to the translator to do their actual work. Our estimates, and this is really very generic, but if you want to get an inkling of what we're talking about, we generally recommend approximately 600 words per day for translation and about 1,000 words per day for editing. So if you have an article of 6,000 words, make sure you give the editor about a week to do their work, obviously from the time that they're available. Oftentimes, translation and editing can be quite costly, so you need to make sure to check funding opportunities within your institution, as well as external funding opportunities to fund that, especially if you're looking to translate a full manuscript, as that can be quite costly. Prepare a glossary of some of the key terms that you're going to be, that you know in advance the translator may struggle with, or may be unique to your field. If you already know what terms you want to use in the target language, so you may as well either prepare a separate glossary, or within the text, the first time the word appears, just put in the translation, or so that the translator knows exactly what word you want them to use, as opposed to them having, to figure it out and may or may not be accurate. And always send a finished paper. I highly recommend for the language step to be the final step before publication, before the actual submission process. If you send a project which is written as a draft and then you ask it for it to be translated or edited, it's very possible you're going to need to go through a number of rounds and revisions until it's really ready to be submitted. All right, now the fourth secret is how to write and not write a cover letter. Okay, and this should be very simple, but I see a lot of issues on cover letters. First of all, before we even delve into what should or should not be written, if the journal writes that they want a cover letter and what they want in it, or they don't want a cover letter, follow the journal instructions. That's generally true of everything I've said in this 45 minutes, an hour that we're together. Is that obviously the most important thing is to follow the instructions of the specific journal and publisher. That being said, if it's left open or if they ask for a cover letter, so we do want to include some of our basic biographical information just to establish our credibility, the title of the paper, and a thank you. Make sure that we thank the reviewers for their time. In the end, like we said, everyone's human, everyone's people. They appreciate being recognized for the time and effort they're putting in, especially at times when they're not being properly compensated for it. Don't include questions about how long it's going to take or what's the process, especially if those details are written on the website somewhere. It just shows that you haven't taken the time to read through. Don't include a long summary of your research. There's a reason that you have an abstract, and generally that abstract is not supposed to go in the email and the cover letter. And definitely don't use poor language. There have been a few articles whereby the article, we worked very hard on an article and then was rejected for language. And when we contacted the journal and asked them what happened, they said, oh, we just saw the cover letter was written very poorly. So we didn't even bother reading the article, and we told them they needed to get it edited. Meanwhile, the cover letter was never sent to us for editing, and the author thought that they could take care of it themselves. So send it to me. I will take care of it. Better to do it that way than have embarrassing mistakes. Now, all right, congratulations. You've gone ahead, you've submitted your article, and you finally got some answers. So let's say you wrote a great article and you got knocked down. It got rejected, and that can be a very tough, difficult feeling, especially when it's something we really believe in, and when it's really hard for us to accept that someone else wouldn't recognize the value in our contribution. Now, first of all, reminder: 80% of journal articles are rejected. So it doesn't mean that there was anything wrong with our article just because it got rejected. And I would go even further. Even if it says, sometimes there are what I like to call template lines, like this article is not relevant to the nature of our journal, or thank you, but we think this journal would be more relevant elsewhere. Sometimes they're just copying and pasting the same answers to everybody, so don't take it personally. Sometimes they really will give you some pointed feedback, which can be very helpful. Regardless, the most important takeaway here is don't let things simmer. You can be sad for 24 hours, take a drink, and move on. Go submit to somewhere else as soon as possible. The worst thing that can happen, and I hear about this from a lot of scholars, is that they are so rejected by their rejection, and they get so down by it that they just say, forget it. I'm forgetting about this paper, and I'll deal with it later. And then it just sits on their computer for months, if not years on end. You got a reasonable revise and submit. Yay, congratulations. That's fantastic. Put the champagne in the fridge. That's awesome. I know that it doesn't always feel awesome when we get 3 pages of feedback, but we need to realize that if they decided to take the time to have it sent out for review, and the reviewer came back with pointed feedback that didn't reject the article, that is cause for celebration in the sense that it shows that they cared, it shows that they were interested, and it shows that we have a chance. Now, that may take a lot of work, and that might be frustrating, but it's a move in the right direction. And even if we get a revise and resubmit, and then it's rejected, in the end, we have hopefully learned from it, because as much as we did discuss in the beginning of the workshop about, or of the webinar about, reviewers who don't understand our research, but most reviewers do understand our research and give us really valuable feedback. So we need to take that in kind. And I want to make one more point about the articles that are rejected. I recently saw a study which blew me away, but it's actually very basic, and that is that articles that were rejected from their first in their first submission and then were sent to a second journal were more successful, again, in terms of impact factor, in terms of how often they're quoted, than articles that were accepted to the first journal they were submitted to. So I think that's a lesson for us also about how we should respond to rejection, and the fact that rejection does not, at least in the first stage, does not necessarily say anything about the quality of the research that we submitted. If our paper was accepted, that's awesome. You know, let the family know, let the friends know, and then we're on to our next project, because we probably already are on to our next project. But seriously, we need to think about, you know, if we did get some sort of feedback, you know, was it mostly bad? Was there some good in it? How do we respond to it? Did all the reviewers agree, or maybe there were differing opinions? And we can learn from that. And think about what's next. And it's not ignoring that that we still have an unpublished article. The final secret is about how to respond to reviewers' critique. And that's, you know, some of these tips are, I guess, generic tips for life, but I want to focus in specifically on what we can do when it comes to journals. So oftentimes journals will ask us for a letter responding to their critique. So first of all, we always need to be polite, even if we think that the reviewers are total nitwits who don't have a clue about our field. We need to be polite. We need to thank them that they've taken their time, again, mostly not compensated, and they have taken the time to review our paper and give us suggestions. Be open to suggestions. Sometimes there are things where we first read it, we say, nah, I don't think so. And then the more we think about it, the more we open ourselves up to being able to receive critique, the more we can really learn and grow from it. Critiquing the critique. Sometimes it's appropriate to say, you know, I appreciate this response, but I disagree because of X, Y, Z. And as long as we've been polite, and as long as we have started off our letter with thanking them for their time, it's okay for us to reject some of the comments. I would recommend that, at least if there's a lot of comments, at least some of them try and implement, or, you know, if they're neutral or if they're positive. But if there are things that you disagree with that you think would do harm to the article, it's okay to present that in a proper way. Take a deep breath. It's not the end. You know, if we got some harsh feedback, we understand that that's part of this process, and that we need to be calm and relaxed, even if it's not the easiest thing to do. We need to figure out if it's a revise and resubmit or it's a rejection. Sometimes the answers can be a bit vague. So, you know, if we're not sure whether it's worth us, you know, spending the time and dedicating our resources to sending to the same journal again, then, you know, we need to think about whether that's, or maybe we should follow up with them and ask them. And general follow up with the journal editors. If we don't get let's say we don't get a response, we sent back our letter, we sent back our revised version, and we don't get a response, follow up with them, ask them what's going on. It's okay, as long as we're not being too pushy. Don't forget to share your research. This is really key. Let's say you got published. Congratulations, that's awesome. Now you need to, we think that that's the end, and we hope that that's the end, but the truth is that in today's day and age, it's very important for us to share. Now, a word of caution, we need to obviously understand what we're allowed to share based on whether it's open access or the traditional model. But whatever it is that we can share, even if it's just the title and the fact that we were published, can be really, really helpful to our career, especially if we're actively involved in our network of our colleagues, which I highly recommend. We need to be present, whether it's in email forums or live conferences or on ResearchGate in academia. We want to be contributing. We want to be adding to the conversation. We want to be a known figure so that when there is the next big project, when there is the next big cooperation and collaboration, people think about us. We're at the top of our minds and the only way to do that is by letting people know about the research that we're actually doing. That's it. Here's our information again. If you have any questions about anything that I said throughout the presentation, other content that you'd like to see that maybe wasn't answered in this specific webinar, if you've got a project that you'd like to consult on that you are curious about, please don't hesitate to be in touch. You've got my email and phone number direct here on the screen. It was really a pleasure giving over this webinar. I very much hope that you learned a few things along the way. So don't be strangers, be in touch, and thank you so much for joining us today on the 5 secrets to publishing your academic article.